This KFAN podcast is sponsored by Builders and Remodelers, exclusive Twin Cities provider of Elements Windows. Get the highest quality windows at unmatchable value. Visit buildersandremodelers.com for more details.
This is the heaviest of Vikings heavyweights leader fan radio network, and KFAN.com. 1 minute and 49 seconds past 3 o'clock. That's Central Daylight Saving Time. Welcome back. It is a Tuesday edition of the Bumper to Bumper program on a decidedly rainy, wet, dark, dank Tuesday afternoon here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. My name is Dan Barreiro. I am the host of the program. Guardsy is the producer of the show, and we are delighted that you are along for today's ride, going all the way once again until 6:30 this very evening. I'm sure most of you have heard already the news breaking on the passing of Jim Marshall, and died at the age, I believe, 87 years old. Been battling some health issues for a significant period of time. I will remind you now that one of his teammates, Chuck Foreman, has agreed to join the show at 5:30 tonight. Guardsy, as it turns out, delivered the news to Chuck Foreman, correct? Chuck did not know until you called him that indeed that story had broken, I think, via the Vikings. I think the Vikings had an official release on it. And again, this is one of those days where you run the risk to a certain extent of discouraging younger Vikings fans and listeners because he's so far removed. The era in which Jim Marshall played is so far removed from the present. But there's also some days where none of that's relevant. And the name is big enough that you say, we've got to do justice to this particular individual and this particular player. And look, the Vikings of the Purple People era, Purple People Eater era, had more accomplished players than Jim Marshall. They had Hall of Fame players. More on that in a minute. But I got to tell you, in the time I've been in this town and the folks I've talked to over the years, which of course starts first and foremost with Bud Grant, but also includes Chuck Foreman, I feel like many of them believed that this is the guy, this is the player who defined that entire era, who defined the team. That's why I say heaviest of the heavyweights. He almost seemed to be them, in part because of his durability, obviously. In part, he was a very good player, by the way. It wasn't like he was a kind of a complimentary player. He was an excellent player on one of the greatest defensive lines in the history of football. But on so many levels, he seemed to be the Vikings. Captain for 14 years. You'll hear some stories later from Chuck that Guardsy has we'll get Chuck later as well. But this is a guy who was team captain for 14 years and basically ran Vikings training camp for Bud Grant. I mean, technically Bud ran it, obviously, but it was, we've been told over and over by how many different people that Marshall was the guy, the only guy that Bud trusted enough to sort of, you run it with the players. You decide who gets the key to get back in Gage Hall. Maybe occasionally a little bit after curfew, right? Everything ran through Jim Marshall. He played 282 games, regular season games. It's well over 300, by the way, if you include playoffs. He never missed a game. His entire NFL career, year one with the Cleveland Browns, and then, of course, the rest of the time with your Minnesota Vikings, he didn't miss any. 282 consecutive regular season games, which is still, I think, a record for defensive players. Favre beat it, but then you say, well, you're a quarterback. God bless you, but that's a little different than playing defensive end your whole career or most of your career. And one of the fascinating aspects of his career that I don't even know if we've spent all that much time on some of the specifics is, I found there was an old Sports Illustrated story. This was from, let's see what year this was written, 1979, which kind of laid out his consecutive game streak. In his effort to make the mind and body totally harmonious, Marshall has given a lot of thought to human behavior, and he has been able to play week after week despite the ankle sprains and concussions that might have sidelined lesser men. Twice, Marshall kept his streak intact by walking out of hospitals where he was recuperating, once from pneumonia, and this season from ulcers. On another occasion, he played after accidentally shooting himself in the side while cleaning a shotgun. Now, in 2025, it's a different world today. I'm guessing that a player wouldn't even be allowed to leave the hospital under those circumstances,
right?
To do to get back to the football field, right? But it was a different world then. And in Marshall's world then, you played. If there was a way for you to play, then you played. Even further back than that, he played with the Browns in 1960. I did not know this one. He contracted encephalitis during military training before the 61 season and was so seriously ill, he even was placed in an induced coma to save his life. I didn't know that one. Then, of course, he gets traded along with 5 players to the expansion Vikings from Cleveland. And Cleveland apparently wanted draft picks in the 1962 draft. And the rest is indeed history. But if you want to subscribe to the Viking myth, right? Plays through everything. Reliable, durable, tough, rugged. This is the guy. Is it not so? This is the guy who personifies all that. And again, some of that you could say is mythology. It's too much. It's not even realistic. It's not real life. But he seemed to come the closest to making that mythology come to life in the way he approached the game. He just refused to sit. He always played. He might even still have the record for fumble recoveries for an end. I think he has either 29 or 30.
30 by a defensive end. Over the course of his career,
by a defensive end. Yep. I think that still might be the record. And by the way, one of them was the infamous one,
right,
in which he ends up running the wrong way, can't be persuaded out of it by a teammate, and ends up going all the way into what he thinks is the end zone for a touchdown for his team, throwing the ball out of bounds in celebration. Unfortunately, it was the wrong end zone, so he handed the other team 2 points, a safety. All the years, we've talked a lot of individuals associated with those Vikings teams. Bud Grant, Jerry Burns, Chuck Foreman, Fran Tarkenton.
Fran, who's who I was thinking of as well.
And the list goes on and on and on. And they all, this is all along, not just now. All along they said, well, it was Marshall's team. He was the guy that we all kind of looked to as sort of the rallying point, the guy who, other than Bud, kind of ran the whole thing. So he should get all the time he deserves today. Even if, like I said, for young Vikings fans, it's a long way from here to there. It's not as relatable if you haven't seen the individual play. I certainly understand that. But when a player transcends whatever his playing career was, the way that Jim Marshall most assuredly did, then you still got to salute him. And we'll be doing it early and often throughout today's show. Do you want to introduce a soundbite now to play one, or are they pretty long?
It's one long 3-minute thing. So if you want to play, maybe next segment.
Maybe we'll
be the
come
time
back
to do it.
next segment.
It's Bud Grant from his last in-studio visit.
Yeah, and Guardsy found this from the archives, which is great. And it's Bud, I think, in some ways, telling us exactly confirming what we have gotten into today. And I don't want to forget the old-timers who are still with us. For them, he's utterly relatable. He will be, for many of the old-timers, seared in their memory as the Viking. Jim Marshall is the Viking. Let's get a pause in early, and we'll get some Bud sound from the last time he was in studio on, quite frankly, he would never say his favorite player. Went out of his way to say, I don't want to do that.
That comes up in the soundbite.
Does it?
Yes,
Good.
from you.
But certainly one of his favorite players. Don't go away. You want more of the myth? How about the blizzard? January 1971. Marshall is with a group of snowmobilers, I should say, 16 of them, that were leaving from Red Lodge, Montana. It was supposed to be a 55-mile snowmobile trip to Cook, Wyoming. They get caught up in what is described as blizzard conditions. And apparently one member of the group even died of exposure after the group kind of got spread out, separated, and their snowmobiles broke down. A few days later, Marshall tells Sid Hartman, finally, young LaVisca, 15 years old, located a piece of land with a grove of trees and a hill in back of it to block the wind. We decided to try and stay there for the night. Snow was about 10 to 15 feet deep in the area. Dixon, I don't know who Dixon is, took out his lighter, and we started the fire with 5 $1 bills, some candy wrappers, my checkbook, and billfold. The snow melted, giving us a hole about 6 feet deep by 8 feet wide. Dixon had some $20 bills to keep the fire going. Money didn't mean anything at this stage. You can't beat nature with money. We would have burned everything we had if necessary. We kept the fire going with any wood which would burn, including pine cones. We also stripped the low branches of 15 to 20 trees. Now, in this version of events, this is from an old story in the Daily Norseman. Marshall and his party were eventually found as well. So it like I said, there, even away from the field, it just feels like, well, yeah, that's what a Viking would do, right? He's a Viking, right? It kind of writes itself, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
It really does. And as I mentioned, there was a big push late in his, late in his life to try to get him to the Hall of Fame, right? Because that was one of the frustrations. Like, he was one of the members of that team that was not quite there, right? In fact, if you go back to 2008, NFL Network named Marshall the second best player not in the Hall. This was on their NFL Top 10 program. They had him behind only a legendary Green Bay Packers offensive lineman named Jerry Kramer, who might have written, by the way, one of the first autobiographical sports books. I think it was called Instant Replay. I can't remember the name of it, but it was it was back before you had many players doing that. And Kramer did get in 2018. Didn't we have him Super Bowl week?
I was just Googling that.
Yeah.
I'm like, we had Jerry Kramer Radio Row at the Mall of America. It was awesome.
He was outstanding.
Yes. And I think he had just gotten in.
You're right.
Like right around that time. Yeah.
In 2023 and 24, Marshall was listed as a semifinalist for the senior nominees, but he failed to advance to the final 12. The problem he had was you needed, usually to get in even late, you need some kind of spectacular number. Like For 4-5 years, they're just dominant numbers. He didn't always necessarily have dominant numbers. He was part of a dominant defensive line, and he defined, obviously, durable, as we laid out here, but that's what seemed to hurt him. I still think not winning a Super Bowl ends up, whether people consciously feel this or not who are voting, gets in the way of it almost becoming automatic for players like Jim Marshall.
Well, not that he's the final word on this, but I happened to watch, getting ready for the show, that NFL Films top 10 players to not be in the Hall of Fame, and I watched the entire Jim Marshall thing, and your guy Mad Dog talked about that. Russo was one of the guys that was interviewed.
Christopher Mad Dog Russo, yeah.
And he kind of said the same thing. He goes, I'm thinking about the Super Bowls with those guys, and the defensive lines, they never got it done in those games. Now, that's a little hyperbolic, but it's also not true. And he said, so for that reason, if it's on the fence, essentially, he's probably not getting my vote as good as he was. So I think there is something to that.
I think I've mentioned this several times on the show over the decades. When I lived downtown, at least for a stretch, Jim Marshall lived in the same high-rise. And I kidded about it at the time. I never really talked to him because I didn't know him all that well. And he was imposing. He had an imposing air about him. And at least once, I will have been at a Wolves game, walked home because it was like walking distance from there. And so it's like now it's probably midnight, 12:30 at night, and I'm in the lobby about to get in the elevator, and Jim Marshall is coming down, or is in that elevator I'm going to get on, sunglasses on, a briefcase, leaving. God knows what he was doing. I have no idea. I'm not saying there was anything askance about it.
Time to go to work.
But whatever it was, it definitely, it's a memory that's kind of seared in my brain and will be for a long time. Let's go ahead and play back what you found on Bud. The last time he was in studio with us, Bud Grant, a good solid 3 minutes of our conversation with Bud when the subject was indeed Jim Marshall. You've always said over the years, I'm not going to say, best player, favorite player, because that's unfair to too many players, and you coached so many great ones. But maybe you can answer this question. Is there a player who comes to mind, if I say to you, who hated losing more than any player you coached?
Mikan.
How about football? That you coached?
Well, you blindsided me with that. I had to think about it. A lot of great competitors, and to reach the level that we're talking about,
right?
Most of those guys, answered the bell. Some didn't, and some reach a certain level during the game, and that's the best they can do. But Jim Marshall comes to mind. I talk about George Mikan. That's basketball. Talk about football. Jim Marshall. And that when I walk into the Vikings, I walked around and not walked around, but I was with the players for a short period of time, and I'd say something. And everybody glanced over at this guy over here. Everybody's looking at Jim Marshall. Well, if Jim Marshall, would shift his eyes, and I could tell if Jim Marshall bought it, they all bought it. So he was our head cow. I mean, you ever know what a bell cow is?
Bell cow, absolutely, yeah.
A bell cow. He was our bell cow. So anytime I might say something, they'd all look at Jim Marshall. If Jim Marshall, he wouldn't have to nod, but he'd just make some kind of a gesture. If Jim Marshall bought it, they all bought it.
I think that's what a lot of great coaches, that's what they figure out, is it can't all be what the coach says. You have to have some lieutenants who are the ones who convey and carry your message. That's really how you become successful. Is that correct?
Well, you're absolutely right. And Jim Marshall was, our bell cow. I figured that out. I figured it out the first preseason we played in Tulsa. We're playing Philadelphia, which is my former team,
right?
And we're talking before the game, and I'm talking about what I expect from them, deportment-wise, not necessarily technical-wise, but their deportment on the field and substitutions and a lot of stuff. And everything I'd say, they'd all glance over to Jim Marshall.
Yeah.
So I figured out he's the guy I should be addressing everything I do to Jim Marshall because he's our bell cow.
Some guys, and what makes a bell cow? personality?
Well, I think competitiveness. Jim Marshall was he falls in the George Viking category. Mm-hmm. Very, very competitive, and never got tired. Always played at full speed. I don't care what the score of the game was. He pressed the button. You're on full speed right now. That was Jim Marshall. He never took a play off, and he'd play many times. We'd play on Sunday, meet on Monday, and Jim Marshall couldn't walk. He had a bad ankle, all swollen up. I said, well, he might be out. By Wednesday, he was full speed. And by Friday, he was ready to go. On Saturday and Sunday, we played.
Bud, in this very studio in December of 2022, Bud passed away in March of 2023, not that much long after there. A great get by Guardsy. That's like the perfect, I don't even call it a soundbite because that's not doing justice to it, to sort of capture the relationship between the head coach, the legendary head coach, and the bell cow. Because that clearly is exactly who Jim Marshall was. You and I have talked about this occasionally. Where to be able to have those interviews, those memories, and the opportunity to tap, for me especially, to tap into sports history in this town the way we've been lucky enough to over the years. Example being an interview like that. That makes every part of this job, I think, worth every moment. Don't you think? I mean, that's
100%.
It's just I can't even begin to convey how appreciative I am that I've been able to be in this position as long as I have been, to have those kind of conversations, look back on them, and all to do, I think, to give proper homage, to pay proper homage to the individuals for these various sports teams, but certainly starting with the Vikings, because we know this is still a Vikings town over many, many decades. We'll get back to this discussion much later with Chuck Foreman, a loving teammate of Jim Marshall, who himself has had some terrific, Jim Marshall stories. He's going to join us at 5:30 tonight. Lou Nanny from Marrakesh tonight. Marrakesh.
After dinner.
Marrakesh Express. Is that right?
I tried to book him for 3:15. He's like, I've got dinner till 4:30, which is like midnight his time.
We're going to find out he had a guy in Marrakesh all along.
Yeah.
Right?
It's ridiculous.
Like he knew what restaurant to go to.
He's got the briefcase like Jim Marshall at midnight, just rolling around Marrakesh. It's something from the 70s we don't even know about.
Chris Hine's got a new book that's out today, right? The Anthony Edwards book. We got a little bit of a preview from him about, a month ago? But he's back to talk about the book now that it is out. And the beauty of it is we can talk about a lot of other stuff, Wolves-related, NBA-related, including the breaking news that our guy Tibbs got
available.
The boot. Thibodeau dismissed as head coach of the New York Knicks. All he did was lead him to the Final Four for the first time in
this century,
25 years, something like that. It's Tibbs, how quickly they forget. In the end, it's always the same, is it not? It's Tibbs' fault.
We're either going to win or lose with Ant. It doesn't mean we're not always trying to look for complementary skill sets that can help him reach his, what we think he can be. But we're either going to win a championship or not get there on the backs of Anthony. And the greatest thing is he embraces that responsibility. He's such a positive teammate. Obviously supremely talented, but I think there's nobody in the league that we could choose that is more ready for that level of responsibility.
And, of course, the voice of the president of basketball operations for the Timberwolves, Tim Conley. Close circuit to Tim. I'm still waiting for your return text. Haven't given up on the idea of getting him in studio or just getting him on at some point, but it didn't go. I thought yesterday might be the day because yesterday he was clearing the decks, talking to media jackals like Christopher Hine, who's in studio with us right now. But
do you want me to send you the audio of Lavelle just going, hello? Hello? And then you can just keep sending it to him in audio form?
That's not a bad idea.
Hello?
That's really not a bad idea at all.
He might answer.
He might, sooner or later. That's very true. Welcome back in. We appreciate having you. You're, as always. And we'll talk about, once again, today is the actual official, the day your book, Ant, drops, right? Yes. It is now available in bookstores. online, all the ways that people get books at this particular point. So we've talked some about the book, but I want to try to cover some more ground on that and get to, if possible, a number of other significant subjects as well. I'm scrolling for a tweet I thought I had saved, but it doesn't appear. Oh, I know what I did. I printed it. That's what it was. That's why I didn't save it.
Old school. Printing.
Printing. Think about it. Yeah, it's unbelievable. You may already know this. I don't know. This was per something called the DKS Sportsbook. Are they considered
DraftKings?
Is that DraftKings?
Yes.
Okay, that would explain it.
Yeah.
Timberwolves are, as of today, the betting favorites to acquire Kevin Durant if the Suns trade him. They've got the Wolves at plus 250, the Rockets at plus 300, Dallas at plus 750, Spurs plus 900, Heat plus 900 as well. Now, that doesn't prove he's going to be dealt, but I do want to start there because all you guys have certainly, I think, been in on the reporting that there was an intense effort to explore possibilities before the trade deadline. And nothing came to fruition, in part because it's very challenging to make that kind of deal right in the second apron. But we're all trying to get a handle on, because we all heard, I think, and we played some sound from Tim yesterday. He's pretty careful. He's pretty measured in his words. But we're always trying to look for messages beyond the words. And as much as he says, I'm a run it back guy, he really hasn't run it back here at all since he's been here. So does that, in your mind, make it any more or less likely that this time he really might want to run it back and not mess with even exploring the option in any sort of intense way to get Kevin Durant? What do you think?
I've kind of thought about it in this way over the last week or so. They're never risk averse, as evidenced by his 3 years here. I think they are patient, though, and wait for the opportunity to strike, whether it's the right timing, the right deal, the right price. As we saw last year, they waited until Dante was on the table in that Knicks deal, and that was 2 days before training camp opened, and then they agreed to it. So I think as I look at this roster now, there could be continuity, and you know that you can win with this roster, but I do think ultimately they're waiting for their moment to strike. This is just me. This is not like reporting or anything. This is just me kind of observing how they've gone about their tenure here. I think they're waiting for that moment to strike. It may be this summer. Maybe it's at the next trade deadline. Maybe it's next summer. Whatever is most convenient or best position for them to strike, I think they will strike and try to remake this squad. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know if it's Kevin Durant. I don't know if it's somebody else.
Garland.
Who they may have,
another
Darius Garland, who they may have in mind.
Right.
But I think as currently constructed, while you can win with this team, I wonder when they look at Anthony Edwards 2, 3, 4 years out, this young core, who best to pair him with?
Right.
You know, I think if a moment comes where you can make a significant addition, they will strike. I just don't know when the timing is going to be of that.
Well, what's interesting to me about that as it pertains to Durant is the assumption is Phoenix is going to want draft choices. So to that extent, it may well be that they're going to move on Durant if they're going to move on him before this draft.
Right.
So I think it's possible on him we might get some resolution. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the Wolves, but that we're going to know fairly fast if indeed, you know, the Suns are saying, well, part of what we're interested in is we don't want you picking for us. We want the draft picks, whatever the case may be, or draft night, in which case a team can obviously pick for what they want.
You do that thing where one team picks, and wears the hat of the other team, and it's not agreed to until 3 weeks later.
It's very funky the way that thing goes. That's exactly it.
That could be that kind of situation.
So, you know, I asked Johnny this yesterday. He was there as well, and I think he got the fairly standard answer. But I'm curious to get your view on this. They go to the Final Four again, NBA's version of the Final Four, 2 straight years, in a year where it looked shaky for a while. And they get there. You know, they find a way to get there, and then they get thumped pretty good, especially at the end. So what's your sense of deep down in the inner circle, how much it does concern or should concern the people who run this team, the coach, even the players to a large extent, the way it ended? You know, because it looked, you were there, from TV, it looked really, really bad. It looked pretty inexcusable to me. Then again, you see a lot of teams that in their last game, they don't look very good, and you say, well, does it really matter in the long run? So how much should it bug this team? How much do you think does it that for 2 straight years, when they got to that Game 5, and I think especially this year, I hate using the cliche about, letting go of the rope, but it felt like 5 minutes into that game, they just said, let's just finish. Let's just end this thing.
I mean, if you listen to Finch, you listen to Tim, they take the long view of it. Yeah. And, I think Finch's quote was, this always ends badly, no matter which way it is, whether you lose at the buzzer, whether you lose by 30, it always ends badly. There's always going to be disappointment no matter what. So I think internally they're not trying to put too much on the specifics of each of these Game 5s and how it ended. It obviously hurts in the fan base, and it hurts when it's a pattern that starts to form like that, okay, it's not just this year, but 2 years in a row now, when you got to Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals, you were spent physically, emotionally, or both. So that'll be interesting to see in future years. But it's also the nature of the playoffs. Like, to your point, like look at what happened to Boston. They beat the Knicks in Game 5 of that series.
Yeah.
And Game 6 was just an extended party in Madison Square Garden.
It's true.
So it's just the nature of the playoffs, and I think the emotions take control of certain teams, and if you don't have it on a given night, you're throwing in the towel mentally at some point. And when the Wolves started 1 for 11 that night in Oklahoma City, it was, you could just see it, and they started rushing everything. Yeah. They got all out of sorts, all out of character, and it was just a snowball from there. It doesn't excuse it, but I just being around Tim and Finch, they take the long view of this stuff. They don't take that one particular game as a big sign of where this team was throughout the course of the season.
Is Edwards the only untradeable player on this team, or is Jaden coming close to that? Because obviously in any deal, including Durant, the assumption is that's the guy that's going to come up. And in the past, I think the Wolves have been pretty adamant about we're not going to move him. He improved his offense this year. He's still young, for God's sake. Do you think he is also untradeable along with Anthony, or not so much?
I wouldn't say untradeable, but the asking price would be really high. And because he showed what he could be on the offensive end, I think the second half of the season, this was the best stretch, I think, of offensive basketball that I've seen Jaden McDaniels play in his career. So you see it coming. You see if he gets more opportunity, what he could be elsewhere. He signed for, I think there's a lot of debate about his contracts. There's some people that'll say this is a massive overpay. Then there are some people that say this is value with where he lines up. I tend to think it's more the latter. For the kind of defense that you get from him on a night in, night out basis. The 3-point shooting, it looks like that 1 year he had of good 3-point shooting might have been more of the exception than the rule. Mm-hmm. His 3-point shooting might be a little lower than where you thought maybe his second year. But I tend to think that, listen, they hung on to him in the Rudy trade and gave up an extra draft pick or two or swap or two because of that. And I just think Tim, and, I have a thing in the book about it too, even is, he had he sit down with Ant and Jaden at one point over the last couple of years and said, you guys are here and this team is going to go through various iterations of, the Rudy Mike iteration is here now. It might not be here or won't be here in future years, just given the ages of the players. And so this team is going to evolve through your tenure here, but it was Ant and Jaden that he had that conversation with. So I think that even that little tidbit can give you a glimpse into how they view Jaden.
Do you sense, will you be surprised if Conley is the starting point guard next season?
I wouldn't be surprised if he was a starter. To me, it's more about how much is he playing versus how much is Rob Dillingham playing. If Rob Dillingham is taken more of the minutes, but he's just coming off the bench the way we saw it with some of these bench guys this year. They're bench players, but they were playing more minutes than Mike Conley was. That to me is more of an indicator. And will they be comfortable closing games with Rob Dillingham is the other part of the equation as well. So I think for the stature of it all, for the status and the respect of, Mike Conley and his career, it wouldn't surprise me if he was starting, but I think ultimately what matters is who's playing more and who's closing.
So Dillingham is obviously a guy who was very promising, highly coveted. They were clearly, Conley was very aggressive in what it cost to go and get him. Players have been known to make significant jumps between their first and second seasons. It looks to me, though, as if he's going to have to make a pretty stupendous leap, even in the eyes of the head coach. Again, you're covering the team every day, but my sense is that I don't sense Finchy loves him yet or trusts him yet, or he gets annoyed with him, it seems to me, more than he does some players. So is it even feasible to think he could make that big of a jump this offseason to, if he's not going to start, be a significant rotation player the way he wasn't as a rookie?
Thought a lot about this too, and I think Rob Dillingham has the tools and the skill set to eventually develop into the kind of player that I think people envision. What I wonder about at 19, 20 years old, will that development happen fast enough for where the Wolves are right now in this moment with Ant at 24,
great question.
Jaden, Nas? I guess we'll find out, and we'll find out what they think in the offseason. If they do make a big move, is he a part of it? That to me is the question. Is Rob Dillingham going to develop fast enough to become a wingman to Ant, to be a reliable point guard? Finch had a lot of praise for Rob throughout the course of the season. I don't know if his lack of playing time was the lack of trust, if it was just the situation overall with it's tough when you're a top 10 pick. You expect to play right away. You don't expect to go to a Western Conference Finals team, and then that team makes a move on top of that to extend their depth. So it's a tough situation for Rob to be coming into, and especially when you look at what they needed off the bench, it wasn't necessarily what Rob was going to give them. But to me, the big question is how fast can he develop? Because right now, at this moment in the Western Conference, at this moment in the Wolves' trajectory, they have a chance to be really good for a number of years. And can they reach that potential with Rob Dillingham playing 30-plus minutes a night? And I don't know what the answer to that question is.
In a perfect world, and this can get us closer to getting back to Anthony Edwards' discussion, there's two ways to go with him moving forward. One is to actually have him handle the ball even more than he already does, and just stop at the pretense of maybe Conley doesn't start at all, and you sort of reconfigure your entire lineup. There's been a lot of, we talked about this yesterday. If you really were to bring Durant in, you got to probably play him at small forward, and so maybe then Ant is at the 1 technically, and Jaden's at the 2,
right,
for the purposes of making this all fit. So you're not playing Durant as a power forward, which probably doesn't make much sense at this point. Then there's the other side, which is, no, let him be a shooting guard. Let him be an off guard in the traditional classic sense, where he actually has less responsibility in that regard, and a point guard who is more in his prime than Mike is at this point. And that's the best way to get to usher in the next era of Anthony Edwards' career. What do you think?
That is where I think this is headed. And I say that because of what it means for Ant on the other side of the floor. Whenever we have heard Chris Finch talk about what is the next step that Anthony Edwards has to take, or that you see him taking to become an MVP candidate instead of just second team All-NBA, the answer always is, I see Anthony Edwards as one of the elite, maybe the best two-way player in basketball. Right now, with the amount that they rely on him offensively, the bandwidth just isn't there for him to be that guy that they envision on the defensive end of the floor. Maybe some of that will come with age and more experience. But right now, all that they ask him to do on offense does not equate to him always maybe being locked in on the other end of the floor. Having somebody that can take a lot of that off of his plate, whether it's a more experienced guard in the prime of their career, like a Darius Garland or whoever that may be, that prototype of player, that to me would seemingly potentially unlock this version of Anthony Edwards that you see, where he could play off ball more. He could be a catch and shoot 3-point guy, which he's very good at. And that saves some of the mental and physical energy for him to be a little more locked in on the defensive end of the floor, take more responsibility on that end of the floor. So to me, when I think about what they envision as the idealized version of Anthony Edwards, you need somebody who can come in here and do that on a regular basis. And right now, as good as Julius Randle was at playmaking the later half of the season, I just don't quite see that regularly. So to me, that's kind of what this roster is missing right now and where it may be headed. Is Rob Dillingham eventually that player? That's the ideal.
But how fast?
But how fast?
Yeah.
Those are the questions that I'm wondering in my head right now.
Does Edwards have to rewire his head in terms of learning how to play, off the ball more? It seemed to me there were stretches where I just felt like he's just in the wing watching. Whoever else has the ball, kind of waiting for it to come back to him. And I don't know, maybe this offense isn't conducive to the kind of cutting where then you're coming off a screen and you're hitting a quick jump shot, mid-range shot, whatever the case may be. Does he need to get better in that area? Do you think he's okay there? What do you think?
I think he could stand to get better at off-ball movement for sure. And even in that Golden State series, the way they won those games on the road was a lot of him moving off the ball. When he dedicated himself to that and played off of Julius and the attention that Julius was getting, that was when Ant truly was open for the first time in that series. So I think that's going to be a huge key for him going forward. And again, it speaks to having people that can demand the attention of the defense and away from him to where he can operate in those spaces. Right now, they just haven't done it regularly enough for him to develop those kind of habits or that kind of play style. But it's possible. He played more off the ball year 2 when, D'Lo was here and Cat was kind of the focal point of the offense that year, in his second season. And he was more of an off ball player then. And then that changed as the years went on. So he's got that ability, but the thing with him is you have to make sure that he's mentally locked in. Ant is at his best when he's either got the ball in his hands or he's defending the person with the ball on both ends of the floor. When he has to move off the ball and defend off the ball, that's when the concentration lapses come in and the loss of focus tends to come in a little bit. It's gotten better over the years, but it's not perfect. And there's certainly ways that he can make strides there, I think.
Chris Hine is our in-studio guest, covers the Timberwolves for the Star Tribune. His new book called Ant is out officially as of today, available at a bookstore near you, online, usual locations as well. If you have questions or comments about the book, about Edwards or anything else, NBA Wolves related, Bradshaw and Bryant KFAN text line is open at 64686. I also want to remind folks that we are covering throughout the show the breaking sad news that Jim Marshall, Minnesota Vikings great, has died at the age of 87 years old. And Chuck Foreman, who was a valued teammate back in the day, back in the Glory Vikings years, is scheduled to join us at 5:30 this evening. So if you have questions for Chuck, you can pass those along to us as well. We may even have more sound to play before this show is done as we try to kind of capture why Marshall's name is so mythic in old style Minnesota Vikings history as well. I want you to ponder during the top of the hour pause here because I think it dovetails with what you try to do in the book as a guy who is, gotten into the Edwards story better than anybody, as this book conveys. And it is related to national reaction to what Ant had to say after the loss that I think from afar falls into the classification of misunderstanding how competitive he is, because we tend to want to hear certain things after a game like that. And if we don't get them, it almost sounds like, well, does it mean anything to him? So I know that's a lot of what you had to explore in the book is sort of getting into Edwards' head, because I think he's wired a little differently in that regard. Tom Crean has told us that many times as well. So ponder that during the break, and we'll get your reaction to the national reaction to what took place, because you were there, obviously, for all of that. And we'll mix in a few other questions and observations as well as we continue with Chris Hine. 64686, as I mentioned, Bradshaw and Bryant, KFAN text line. Back in a minute.